The chandeliers of Ashworth Manor blazed with 1,000 candles, their light cascading across the grand ballroom in waves of gold that caught on silk gowns and glittering jewels, transforming the assembled nobility into a constellation of earthly stars. The autumn air beyond the tall windows held the first bite of approaching winter, but within these walls, the heat of bodies pressed close together, of champagne flowing freely, of whispered gossip and loud laughter, created an atmosphere thick enough to taste. Duke Callum Ashworth stood at the heart of it all, a figure of masculine perfection in his tailored evening clothes, his dark hair swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble for all the warmth it showed. Beside him, Lady Victoria Pemberton radiated the confident beauty of a woman who knew herself destined for a duchess's coronet, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they greeted guest after guest with the practiced grace of those born to such displays. The occasion demanded splendor. After all, this was the formal announcement of their engagement, the union of two great families, the merger of fortunes and bloodlines that would be whispered about in drawing rooms for months to come. The orchestra played something light and airy. Couples swept across the polished floor in elaborate dances, and servants moved like shadows bearing trays of delicacies that cost more than a working family might earn in a year. Yet beneath the glitter and performance, something shifted in the air, a subtle change like the moment before a storm breaks. The whispers began at the periphery of the crowd, a ripple moving inward, his heads turning toward the grand entrance where the butler stood, frozen in an attitude of such complete shock that several guests paused mid-conversation to follow his gaze. She appeared like an apparition conjured from conscience itself, a figure in a simple traveling dress of dove grey that seemed almost colourless against the peacock display surrounding her. Eleanor Ashworth had not adorned herself for this moment. She wore no jewels, no elaborate coiffure, nothing to announce her rank or station, beyond the quiet dignity in her bearing and the unmistakable swell of her belly that proclaimed her condition to every eye that fell upon her. She stood in the doorway as the music faltered and died, one hand resting protectively over the child she carried, the other clutching her reticule as though it might anchor her to this moment of terrible courage. The Duke's face, that carefully maintained mask of aristocratic composure, drained of all colour as his eyes met hers across the expanse of gleaming floor. In that instant, Callum Ashworth confronted the truth he had spent 5 years trying to bury, the secret he had locked away in a countryside estate and visited only when duty or desire briefly overcame his determination to pretend she did not exist. His secret wife had come to claim her place, and the foundations of the life he had constructed began, with the inexorable certainty of all long-denied reckonings, to crack beneath his feet. 5 years earlier, on a grey morning that seemed to leach all colour from the world, Eleanor had stood in the small chapel of her father's estate and spoken vows that should have marked the beginning of her life, but instead became the end of every girlish dream she had ever harboured. She had been 19 then, still young enough to believe in fairy tales, despite the harsh realities that had brought her to this moment: her father's gambling debts, the estate on the brink of ruin, the desperate negotiations that had resulted in this arrangement with the wealthy Duke of Ashworth, who needed a wife of respectable birth, if not notable fortune. Callum had arrived for the ceremony with the enthusiasm of a man attending his own execution, his face a mask of such complete indifference that Eleanor felt herself shrinking under the weight of his gaze, or rather, the lack of any real seeing in it, as though she were merely an inconvenient obstacle between him and whatever life he had planned that did not include her. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of half-remembered words: the cold press of the ring against her finger, the brief and perfunctory kiss that held all the warmth of winter stone. Within hours of the wedding breakfast, a stilted affair where conversation died in awkward silences, Callum had handed her into a carriage bound for Willowmere Estate, a property she had never seen, in a region she did not know, with instructions delivered through his steward that she would find the household adequately staffed for her needs, and that the Duke would visit when his schedule permitted. She had watched his figure disappear back into her father's house without a backward glance, and in that moment, Eleanor understood with devastating clarity that she had been purchased and shelved like an unwanted book, set aside to gather dust in some forgotten corner of her husband's life. Willowmere, when she arrived after 2 days of travel, and proved beautiful in its isolation, a manor house of modest proportions, surrounded by overgrown gardens and rolling fields that stretched toward distant woods, but its beauty could not compensate for the crushing loneliness that became her constant companion. The staff, though kind, numbered only 5, an elderly housekeeper, a cook, 2 maids, and a groundskeeper, all of whom treated her with a gentle pity that made her want to weep. Callum's visits came rarely, perhaps once every 2 or 3 months, and when he did appear, he remained no more than a night, conducting himself with the cold courtesy one might show a stranger, speaking only when necessary, retiring to separate chambers, and departing before she woke. Eleanor had tried, in those early months, to be the wife she imagined he wanted. She dressed carefully for his visits, ordered special meals, attempted conversation about his life in London and his work in Parliament, anything that might bridge the chasm between them. But her efforts met only silence or monosyllabic responses that made her feel foolish for hoping. She was, she came to understand, not a wife but a duty discharged, a problem solved, a woman whose existence he acknowledged only in the privacy of a countryside estate where no one who mattered would ever know she bore his name. The silence that descended upon the ballroom held a quality beyond mere absence of sound, a suffocating weight that pressed against every chest, stilled every breath, transformed the glittering assembly into a tableau of frozen shock, as Eleanor stood trembling in the doorway, her courage a fragile thing that threatened to shatter with each heartbeat that thundered in her ears. Victoria's hand tightened on Callum's arm, her beautiful face turning toward him with confusion blooming into something darker, something that understood betrayal even before comprehension fully arrived, and her voice, when it came, carried the crystalline precision of breaking glass. "Callum, who is this woman, and why does she stare at you as though—" But Eleanor did not wait for him to answer, could not bear to hear whatever lie or dismissal might fall from his lips, and so she stepped forward, each footfall against the polished floor echoing like a judge's gavel, and her voice, when she spoke, carrying across the vast space with a clarity born of desperation and determination intertwined. "I am Eleanor Ashworth," she said, and the name that she had carried in secrecy for 5 long years now became a declaration, a truth spoken into existence before witnesses who could not unhear it. "Duchess of Ashworth, wed to Duke Callum Ashworth these 5 years past, and I have come to claim what is mine by law and by right." The gasps that rippled through the crowd should have terrified her, and the wide eyes and whispered exclamations should have sent her fleeing back into the night from which she had emerged. But Eleanor had not traveled this distance, had not spent months building the courage for this moment, and to retreat now when her child's future hung in the balance. She watched Callum's face cycle through emotions too quickly to name shock, giving way to rage, giving way to something that might have been panic or might have been recognition, and she saw the moment when his mind began calculating costs and consequences, weighing his reputation against the undeniable truth standing before him swollen with his child. He could deny her, she knew. He could call her mad, a fortune-seeker, an impostor, and perhaps some in this room would believe him, but his mother would not, and the marriage certificate locked in her reticule would not, and the vicar who had performed the ceremony would not, and eventually the truth would emerge as it always did, more damaging for having been contested. "This cannot be," Victoria breathed, and Eleanor felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for this woman who had done nothing wrong, who had been promised a duke and a future, and now found both dissolving before her eyes. But sympathy could not deter Eleanor from her purpose, not when she thought of the child growing beneath her heart, the innocent life that deserved a father's name and a mother freed from shadows. Callum stood as though turned to stone, his aristocratic composure warring with something more primal, something that Eleanor recognized because she had felt it herself in the lonely years at Willowmere. The terror of having one's carefully constructed world collapse, the exposure of truths meant to remain buried, the helplessness of watching control slip away like water through desperate fingers. "I did not come to ruin you," Eleanor said softly, though her words carried to every straining ear in the vast room. "I came because our child deserves more than I was given, deserves acknowledgement and legitimacy, deserves a father who does not hide its existence like a shameful secret." She rested her hand upon her belly, feeling the flutter of movement there, in the life that had given her the strength for this confrontation, the love that had transformed her from the broken girl who had accepted exile into a woman who would fight for what was right. And in that moment, Eleanor knew that whatever came next, whatever price she paid for this public revelation, she had already won the only victory that mattered. She had found her voice, and she would never again be silent. The second winter of Eleanor's marriage arrived with bitter winds that rattled the windows of Willowmere and seemed to carry with them the last remnants of hope she had harbored, that her circumstances might somehow improve, that Callum might one day see her as more than an inconvenient obligation, tucked away where polite society need never acknowledge her existence. She had learned by then to fill her days with purpose, rather than waiting for a husband who came less frequently with each passing month, throwing herself into the restoration of the estate's long-neglected gardens, spending hours with her hands in the earth coaxing life from soil that had gone fallow, finding in the patient work of cultivation a meditation that soothed the ache of loneliness that had become her constant companion. Mrs. Hewitt, the elderly housekeeper whose kind eyes held a lifetime of wisdom, became something like a friend in those quiet months, teaching Eleanor the rhythms of the household, sharing stories of Willowmere's history, treating her with a gentle respect that made Eleanor want to weep for its rarity in her life. The other staff members, young Mary who helped in the kitchen, Sarah who managed the light cleaning, old Thomas who tended the grounds, and Mrs. Copper, the cook who ruled her domain with fierce efficiency, gradually warmed to her presence, their initial wariness giving way to genuine affection as they recognized that their young mistress possessed neither arrogance nor cruelty, only a desperate need for human connection that she tried so hard to hide behind brave smiles. When word came in late November that the Duke would visit for 2 days before continuing to a house party in the neighboring county, Eleanor found herself seized by a frantic energy, directing the staff in preparations that she knew even then were foolish, were the actions of a woman still clinging to dreams that should have died long ago. She ordered Callum's favorite dishes from the cook, arranged fresh flowers in his chambers despite the season making them costly, selected her finest gown, a deep green silk that had been part of her modest trousseau, and practiced in her mirror, the sort of welcoming smile a wife might offer a husband she had not seen in 4 long months. He arrived on a grey afternoon with rain threatening, his greeting as perfunctory as always, his eyes sliding past her as though she were part of the furniture, and Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest, even as she maintained her composure. Led him to the dining room where the special meal waited, watched him eat in complete silence, while she attempted conversation that died stillborn in the Kung air between them. She asked about London, about Parliament, about the approaching holidays, receiving only single-word responses or slight nods, and with each minute that passed, Eleanor felt herself becoming more invisible, less substantial, until she wondered if she had become a ghost, haunting her own life, speaking words that no one could hear, existing in a space that no one acknowledged. When she woke before dawn to find his side of the bed he had occupied with the enthusiasm of a man fulfilling a distasteful duty, already empty, his belongings gone, his departure accomplished without farewell or explanation, Eleanor finally understood with devastating clarity that she was not living in a marriage, but rather serving a life sentence in a beautiful prison, and that her warden felt not even enough interest to be deliberately cruel, only the crushing indifference of a man who had filed her away as a problem solved and forgotten. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring drawn to its limit, the ballroom holding its collective breath as Eleanor's declaration hung in the perfumed air, and then a figure emerged from the crowd with the decisive authority of one accustomed to command. The Dowager Duchess Marianne Ashworth moving through the frozen assembly with her silver head held high, and her expression carved from determination and something that might have been long-suppressed fury. "What my son has failed to acknowledge," the Dowager said, her voice carrying the weight of aristocratic certainty across the vast space, "is that this young woman speaks the truth, that she has indeed been Duchess of Ashworth these 5 years past, been wed legally and properly, in a ceremony I was not permitted to attend, but whose validity I have nevertheless verified through every legal channel available to me." The gasps that followed this pronouncement came layered with shock and fascination, the assembled nobility recognizing in this moment a scandal of proportions that would fuel gossip for seasons to come, and Eleanor felt her knees weaken with relief, even as she struggled to process that Callum's own mother had known of her existence, had apparently investigated the marriage, had chosen this moment of maximum impact to reveal her knowledge. Callum's face had gone beyond pale, into a greyish hue that spoke of a man watching his carefully constructed world crumble, his hand falling away from Victoria's arm as though he could no longer bear even that innocent contact. And when he finally found his voice, it emerged rough and strained. "Mother, what are you? This is not the time or place." But the dowager cut him off with a look that could have frozen summer itself. "On the contrary, this is precisely the time and place, for you have made it so by attempting to enter into a bigamous engagement while your lawful wife carried your child in exile," the dowager declared, and Eleanor watched the crowd's opinion shifting like sand beneath waves, some faces showing sympathy for Eleanor, while others displayed the eager cruelty of those who delighted in watching the mighty fall, and still others reflected the careful neutrality of people calculating which side would prove most advantageous to support. Victoria, to her eternal credit, drew herself up with a dignity that made Eleanor's heart ache for her, this innocent woman caught in a web not of her making, and she addressed Callum with a voice that trembled only slightly. "I believe, Your Grace, that you owe me the courtesy of an explanation, though I suspect that nothing you say will make this betrayal less complete." And then she turned to Eleanor with eyes that held anger but also a painful understanding, nodding once in acknowledgement, before gathering her skirts and walking from the ballroom with her head high, her mother and sisters hurrying after her, leaving whispers and speculation in their wake. Eleanor felt Callum's hand suddenly grip her elbow, not gently but with a desperate pressure that bordered on pain, and he was steering her toward a side door, his face a mask of barely controlled emotion, and though part of her wanted to resist his high-handed command, another part recognized that they needed privacy for what must come next, needed to escape the avid eyes and eager ears that surrounded them. The dowager followed at a short distance, her presence both shield and witness, and as they reached the drawing room and Callum all but pushed Eleanor through the doorway, she turned to face him with her heart hammering against her ribs, but her outward demeanor maintained through sheer force of will, knowing that this confrontation would determine everything that followed, would shape the future of the child she carried and the life she might yet claim for herself. The drawing-room door closed behind them, with a finality that seemed to seal them into a space too small for the enormity of what hung between them. And Callum released Eleanor's elbow as though her skin had burned him, immediately putting the width of the room between them as he turned on her, with eyes blazing with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Something beyond anger, something that looked almost like terror beneath the fury. "What in God's name possessed you to appear tonight, to humiliate me before all of society, to destroy everything I've built?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous, his hands clenched at his sides as though fighting the urge to strike something. Though Eleanor suspected it was not her, he wanted to hit, but rather the walls that confined him, the circumstances that had shattered his careful control. She stood very still, her hands folded protectively over the swell of her abdomen, and when she spoke, her voice carried a quietness that somehow made it more powerful than any shout could have been. "I came because 3 months ago I discovered I was carrying your child, and I realized that I could not, would not, raise this baby in the shadows where you have kept me. I could not teach our son or daughter to accept a life of shame and secrecy as though they were something to be hidden away like a scandal or a mistake." Callum's face contorted with something between anguish and rage, and he began to pace the room like a caged animal, his words tumbling out in a rush. "You speak of shame? You, who have just destroyed my engagement, ruined my reputation, made me a laughingstock? Do you have any conception of what you've done?" Eleanor felt something cold and hard settle in her chest, a terrible clarity that cut through years of hoping he might one day care, and she replied with devastating calm, "I have given you a choice, Callum, which is more courtesy than you have ever extended to me. In 5 years of marriage, you may acknowledge us, publicly claim me as your wife, and this child as your heir, and we shall find some way to build a life together, or you may grant me a divorce, and we shall both be free, and you to find another suitable bride, and I to raise our child somewhere far from your indifference." The word divorce seemed to strike him like a physical blow, and he stopped his pacing abruptly, staring at her as though she had transformed into someone he had never seen before, and indeed perhaps she had, for the woman who stood before him now bore little resemblance to the frightened girl he had wed and abandoned. "You cannot mean divorce is impossible, the scandal would be—" But Eleanor interrupted him with a bitter laugh that held no humor whatsoever. More scandalous than a duke maintaining a secret wife while courting another, more damaging than the truth that has just been revealed to 300 of your closest peers. Callum had no answer for that. His mouth opening and closing as he struggled with thoughts and feelings he seemed unable to articulate, and watching him, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of pity and resolve, for she could see that he was a man who had never been forced to confront the consequences of his own choices, who had lived his entire life arranging the world to his comfort without regard for those he crushed beneath his decisions, and now that world had finally refused to cooperate with his vision of how things should be. 3 years into their marriage, Eleanor had learned the particular alchemy of transforming loneliness into purpose, had discovered that an estate left to neglect could become a canvas for creation, if one possessed sufficient determination and a willingness to dig one's hands into the earth alongside those who worked it, and Willowmere, under her careful stewardship, had begun to bloom in ways that surprised even the long-time staff who had served there through decades of indifferent management. The gardens that had once been overgrown tangles of thornbush and strangling vine now displayed careful arrangements of roses and lavender, hollyhocks and foxglove, each bed planned not merely for beauty, but for the practical provision of cutting flowers for the house and herbs for the still-room, where Eleanor had learned to make remedies and preserves, and the kitchen gardens produced vegetables in such abundance that she had instituted a system of sharing the surplus with the village families, earning their gratitude and loyalty in ways that gold could never purchase. It was on a particularly fine afternoon in late August, with the sun warm on her shoulders and the scent of late-blooming roses heavy in the air, that Eleanor found herself kneeling in the south garden alongside old Thomas, the head groundskeeper who had overcome his initial skepticism about a young duchess who insisted on working beside him to become something approaching a friend. And they were engaged in a battle of wills with a particularly stubborn rosebush that had grown wild and woody, resisting all attempts at civilized pruning. "The thing's got ideas above its station, Your Grace," Thomas observed with the dry humor he'd developed over their years of shared labor. "Thinks it can grow however it pleases, without regard for the order we're trying to establish." And Eleanor had laughed, truly laughed in a way she rarely did anymore, her face dirt-smudged and her hands scratched from thorns, replying that perhaps the rose had the right idea, that there was something to be said for refusing to be constrained by others' expectations of proper behavior. It was precisely at this moment that Callum's carriage had arrived unannounced, as his visits always were, giving her no time to prepare or present herself as the dignified duchess she was supposed to be, and he had found her there in the garden, looking more like a common labourer than the wife of one of England's premier peers, her dress simple and practical, her hair escaping its pins, her hands covered in soil, and something in her unguarded joy, in the genuine warmth of her laughter, had struck him with a force he could neither understand nor name. He had stood watching from the terrace for several minutes before she noticed him, and in those minutes something uncomfortable had shifted in his chest, some recognition that the woman before him possessed a vitality and contentment that had nothing to do with him, that she had built a life in his absence rather than pining for his attention, and this realization disturbed him in ways he refused to examine too closely. When Eleanor finally saw him, he watched the light drain from her face like water from a broken vessel, watched her transformation from genuine happiness to careful courtesy, and though he told himself he was relieved that she knew her place, knew not to presume familiarity, some part of him mourned the loss of that unguarded smile, even as he greeted her with his customary coldness, even as he retreated into the armor of ducal formality that kept the world at a safe distance, disturbed by the strange ache her contentment without him had created, and an ache he would carry back to London like a splinter lodged too deep to remove. Eleanor rose from where she had stood with a quiet dignity that seemed to cost her everything, smoothing her dress over her swollen abdomen with hands that trembled only slightly, and she said in a voice that carried the weight of 5 years of dismissal, "I shall find lodgings at the village inn until you have made your decision, as I would not wish to impose upon your hospitality any longer than necessary." But before she could take more than 2 steps toward the door, Callum heard himself speak with a vehemence that surprised them both. "Absolutely not, you cannot. I forbid you to stay at some common inn in your condition." And even as the words left his mouth, he felt confusion wash over him, For when had he ever cared where she laid her head? When had her comfort or safety ever troubled his sleep? Eleanor turned to look at him with eyes that held such weariness, such bone-deep exhaustion that went far beyond the physical demands of pregnancy, and she observed with devastating quietness, "How interesting that you suddenly concern yourself with my accommodations, when for 5 years you have never once asked where I slept or whether I was comfortable, never once cared if I was alone or frightened or in need of anything at all." And the truth of her words struck him like a blow, leaving him standing mute and helpless, his mouth opening to offer some defense or explanation that would not come, his mind a chaos of emotions he had no names for and no experience managing. The drawing-room door opened before he could formulate any response, and his mother swept in with the bearing of a woman who had commanded ballrooms and broken social climbers for 40 years, her keen eyes taking in the scene with a single comprehensive glance before she declared, "Eleanor, my dear, you shall stay here at Ashworth Manor in the Duchess's chambers, as is your right, and has always been your right, and I shall hear no argument from either of you on this matter." And she moved to Eleanor's side with a protective tenderness that made Callum realize with dawning shock that this was not their first meeting, that there was a familiarity between them that spoke of established relationship rather than new acquaintance. His mother continued, placing a gentle hand on Eleanor's arm, "I have had your things brought up from the inn where you stayed last night, yes, Callum. She was sensible enough to secure lodgings before confronting you, though she should never have had to, and I have instructed Mrs. Henderson to prepare a light supper for you in your chambers, as you must be exhausted from this evening's ordeal." And watching them together, seeing the way Eleanor leaned almost imperceptibly into his mother's support, the way the Dowager Duchess's expression softened with genuine affection, Callum felt the ground shift beneath his understanding of the past years. "Mother," he began, his voice strange even to his own ears, "how long have you?" But the Dowager cut him off with a look that could have frozen wine in July, replying with Arctic precision, "I have been visiting Eleanor at Willowmere every month for the past 2 years, Callum, ever since I discovered quite by accident that you had hidden away a wife as though she were something shameful, and I have found her to be one of the finest women I have ever had the privilege to know, which is considerably more than I can say for my son at this particular moment." And with that pronouncement she guided Eleanor from the room, leaving Callum alone with the wreckage of everything he thought he knew about his carefully constructed life. The Dowager Duchess had arrived at Willowmere on a crisp October afternoon 4 years into Eleanor's exile, her grand carriage rolling up the drive without prior announcement, in a manner so reminiscent of her son that Eleanor had felt her stomach clench with old anxiety. But when the older woman had descended with the aid of her footman and turned to survey both the estate and its mistress with those keen grey eyes that missed nothing, her expression had held not coldness, but something that looked remarkably like sorrow mixed with determination. "My dear girl," she had said without preamble, crossing to where Eleanor stood frozen on the front steps, "I have only just discovered the full extent of my son's shameful behavior, and I have come to offer you the apologies he should have made years ago, but lacks the courage and decency to deliver." And before Eleanor could formulate any response, the Dowager had taken her hands with surprising gentleness, adding, "I knew he had married, of course, but he led me to believe you preferred the country, that you were content with the arrangement, and it was only when I encountered Mrs. Phillips at a charity function last month, and she mentioned in passing her concern for the young Duchess, languishing alone at Willowmere, that I began to suspect the truth." The weeks that followed had brought a transformation in Eleanor's existence that she had not known possible, for the Dowager Duchess proved to be everything Eleanor's own mother might have been had she lived past Eleanor's 10th year, warm and fierce, and possessed of a wit sharp enough to cut through pretension, while somehow never wounding those who did not deserve wounding. They had taken tea together that first afternoon in Eleanor's modest sitting room, and the older woman had looked around at the simple furnishings, the mended curtains, the obvious economy of the household, and her mouth had tightened with what Eleanor would later recognize as barely suppressed fury at her son's neglect, before she had said with careful control, "Tell me everything, child, and spare no detail, for I cannot remedy what I do not understand." Eleanor had found herself speaking of things she had never voiced aloud, of the loneliness and the hope that had slowly withered, of her attempts to be worthy of notice, and her eventual acceptance that she never would be. And the Dowager had listened with an attention that felt like benediction, occasionally reaching out to pat Eleanor's hand or offer a handkerchief when tears threatened. It was during their third visit, when autumn had begun to give way to the first whispers of winter, that the Dowager had shared the history that cast new light on Callum's cruelty, explaining how his father, the old Duke, had been a man of rigid coldness, who believed emotion was weakness, how Callum's beloved younger sister had died of fever when Callum was 12, and the boy had been forbidden to grieve openly, had learned to bury everything tender beneath layers of ice and duty. "I do not tell you this to excuse him," the Dowager had said with careful emphasis, her eyes holding Eleanor's with an intensity that demanded understanding. "For there is no excuse for how he has treated you, no justification for the pain he has caused through his cowardice, but perhaps it helps to know that his cruelty stems from fear rather than hatred, from wounds he has never allowed to heal." And Eleanor had found herself weeping, not just for her own suffering, but for the damaged boy who had grown into a man incapable of accepting love, even as she recognized that understanding his pain did not erase her own or obligate her to forgive what remained unforgivable. The Duchess's chambers at Ashworth Manor were everything Eleanor had imagined they might be during those long years at Willowmere, when she had allowed herself the dangerous indulgence of dreaming about her rightful place. All cream silk wallpaper and gilt-edged mirrors, furniture of such exquisite craftsmanship that she found herself afraid to touch anything, lest she somehow prove herself unworthy of such surroundings. And as she lay in the massive four-poster bed with its heavy brocade curtains, she felt simultaneously like an imposter and like someone who had finally come home after a very long exile. Sleep would not come despite her exhaustion, for her mind kept replaying the events of the evening. The shocked faces in the ballroom, Callum's stricken expression, the Dowager's unexpected championship, and beneath it all thrummed a persistent anxiety about the child she carried, the way her heart had raced during the confrontation, the tightness she had felt in her abdomen, that might have been merely tension or might have been something more worrisome. Meanwhile, 3 corridors away in his study, Callum paced before the dying fire like a caged animal, unable to settle, unable to think, unable to do anything but replay his mother's words about her secret visits to Willowmere, about Eleanor being one of the finest women she had ever known. And he found himself wondering, with something approaching anguish, what kind of man he had become, that his own mother had felt compelled to hide her relationship with his wife from him, what depths of cruelty he must have displayed to necessitate such secrecy. The knock on his study door came just past 2 in the morning, tentative but insistent, and when he opened it to find young Thomas the footman standing there with worry creasing his features, Callum felt his heart seize even before the boy spoke. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but Her Grace has requested that Dr. Morrison be sent for immediately, as she's experiencing some distress with the baby and fears something may be wrong." And Callum did not remember making the decision to move, knew only that he was suddenly racing through the corridors toward the Duchess's chambers, with a terror clawing at his chest that felt entirely disproportionate to his professed indifference. He burst through the door to find Eleanor sitting upright in bed, one hand pressed to her swollen belly, her face pale but composed in that way he was beginning to recognize as her response to fear, and she looked up at his entrance with surprise that quickly shifted to wariness, saying, "I did not mean for you to be disturbed. I merely asked that the physician be summoned as a precaution." But he crossed to her bedside before she could finish speaking, finding himself asking with an urgency that shocked them both, "Are you in pain? Is the baby moving? What can I do?" "Doctor." Morrison arrived within the hour, his examination thorough and professional, while Callum paced outside the door until the elderly physician emerged with reassurance that both mother and child appeared perfectly healthy, that the tightness Eleanor had felt was likely merely the result of an extraordinarily stressful day, and that rest and calm would remedy all. Callum insisted on being allowed to see her, ignoring the doctor's raised eyebrows at such husbandly concern from a man known for his neglect, and when he entered to find Eleanor settled back against the pillows with tea and colour returning to her cheeks, he pulled a chair to her bedside and asked the first genuine question he had ever posed to her in 5 years of marriage. "How far along are you, and has the pregnancy been difficult?" Eleanor studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to trust this sudden interest, before answering with careful neutrality. 5 months now, and it has been easier than I feared, though lonely as everything else at Willowmere has been lonely. and something in her quiet acknowledgement of that loneliness, spoken without accusation but heavy with truth, made Callum want to offer confessions and apologies he did not yet know how to voice. The days that followed Eleanor's dramatic appearance at the engagement ball brought a storm of gossip that swept through London's drawing rooms like wildfire, each retelling adding fresh embellishments until the truth became nearly unrecognizable beneath layers of speculation and scandal, and Callum found himself forced to navigate the treacherous waters of society's judgment while simultaneously confronting the reality of a wife he could no longer pretend did not exist. He had sent formal notice to Victoria's father the morning after the ball, requesting a private meeting where he had confessed the full truth of his prior marriage and offered whatever restitution might ease the damage to Victoria's reputation. And though Lord Pemberton had been coldly furious, Victoria herself had displayed a dignity that shamed Callum further, saying only that she was grateful to learn his true character before binding herself to him permanently, and that she hoped someday he might learn to value the woman he actually married. The public acknowledgement came next, a formal announcement in the Times declaring that His Grace, the Duke of Ashworth, was pleased to present his wife of 5 years, the Duchess Eleanor Ashworth, to London society, the strained formality of the wording unable to disguise the scandal beneath, and within hours their townhouse was besieged by calling cards from the curious and the cruel alike, titled, "Ladies who came ostensibly to welcome Eleanor, but really to assess her worthiness and gather details for their next gossip session." Eleanor handled each visit with a grace that astonished Callum when he observed from the doorway of the drawing room, her responses to probing questions perfectly calibrated to reveal nothing while giving no offense, her simple gowns somehow conveying more elegance than the elaborate confections worn by her visitors, and he found himself wondering how he had ever dismissed her as insignificant when she clearly possessed a strength of character that half the ton would never achieve. It was on the 4th afternoon, when the parade of callers had finally ceased and the house had settled into quiet, that Callum went in search of Eleanor and found her in the library, and curled in the window seat with a slim volume of poetry, afternoon sunlight turning her hair to burnished gold, and something about the peaceful absorption on her face as she read made him hesitate in the doorway, reluctant to disturb her solitude. She looked up as though sensing his presence, her expression shifting to polite wariness, and he found himself crossing to see what she was reading, the words leaving his mouth before he could consider them. "Coleridge, I see, though not the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner that everyone knows but the earlier work, the conversation poems." And her eyes widened with surprise as she responded, "You know his work beyond the famous pieces." They fell into discussion as naturally as breathing, debating the merits of Frost at Midnight versus This Lime Tree Bower, My Prison, discovering a shared appreciation for the way Coleridge captured the intersection of nature and human consciousness, and for the first time since their wedding 5 years prior, Callum forgot to maintain his careful distance, forgot to guard against connection, found himself simply talking with another person who understood the subtle beauty of words, arranged just so. The hour grew late around them as they moved from Coleridge to Wordsworth to the lesser-known metaphysical poets, Eleanor's face animated in a way he had never seen, her intelligence evident in every observation, and when she quoted from memory a passage from John Donne that perfectly captured a point she was making, Callum felt something crack in the armor he had built around his heart, a fissure through which light began to seep, despite all his years of careful fortification. That night in the library stayed with Callum long after Eleanor had excused herself to rest, the memory of her animated face as she discussed poetry lingering in his mind with uncomfortable persistence, and as he sat alone in his study with a glass of brandy, he found himself pulled inexorably backward through time to another night 5 years prior, to the wedding night that had set the tone for everything that followed, and he remembered with painful clarity the young woman Eleanor had been then, barely 20 years old, her eyes wide with nervous hope as she had stood in the doorway of what should have been their shared chambers, wearing a nightgown of delicate lace that someone had surely told her was appropriate for a wedding night. He had looked at her standing there with her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her hands twisted together anxiously, and had felt nothing but a violent surge of resentment, for she was not Rosalind, would never be Rosalind, could never replace the woman he had loved with desperate intensity since his university days, the merchant's daughter whose quick mind and quicker smile had captivated him completely, despite her lack of title or fortune, and whom his father had forbidden him to marry, with threats that still echoed in Callum's memory years after the old Duke's death. Rosalind had married a businessman from Manchester just 3 weeks before Callum's own arranged wedding to Eleanor, the announcement arriving like a blade to his chest, and he had stood at the altar beside Eleanor, speaking vows that felt like lies while imagining Rosalind in another man's arms, building a life that should have been theirs, bearing children that should have carried the Ashworth name, if only he had possessed the courage to defy his father's iron will. So when Eleanor had approached him on their wedding night with tentative steps and a soft "Your Grace" on her lips, he had turned away with deliberate coldness and said words designed to wound. "I shall be sleeping in the adjoining chamber tonight, and every night hence, as this marriage is one of convenience only, and I have no intention of pretending otherwise." And he had watched her face crumple before she mastered herself. He watched hope die in her eyes, to be replaced by a hurt so profound it should have moved him to compassion, but instead only deepened his cruelty. For her pain was easier to bear than his own, and her disappointment gave him something to hide behind, a shield against the vulnerability of genuine connection. He had told himself in the days and years that followed that he was protecting them both, that refusing to consummate the marriage or acknowledge Eleanor publicly was a kindness that would allow them both to eventually seek annulment and find happiness elsewhere, but the truth that he could no longer deny as he sat in his study, remembering the brightness in her eyes when she quoted Donne, was that he had been punishing her for not being Rosalind, making her pay for his own cowardice in failing to fight for the woman he loved, and that every cold word and calculated absence had been an act of cruelty, born not from indifference but from a fear so profound it had poisoned everything it touched. The fear that if he allowed himself to care for Eleanor even slightly, he would lose her too, and that losing someone again would destroy whatever fragments of his heart still remained intact. The weeks that followed their library conversation brought a subtle shift in the atmosphere of Ashworth Manor, like the first tentative warmth after a long winter, and Callum found himself seeking Eleanor's company with an eagerness that would have bewildered him mere months before, joining her for breakfast in the morning room, where sunlight streamed through tall windows and turned her teacup to translucent porcelain, lingering over dinner conversations that stretched long into the evening as they discovered shared opinions on everything from estate management to the shameful conditions of London's workhouses, and he watched with growing fascination as her pregnancy advanced and her body changed to accommodate the child growing within, the soft swell of her abdomen becoming more pronounced with each passing day, until she moved with the careful grace of a woman carrying precious cargo. He found himself noticing small things he had never allowed himself to see before. The way she touched her belly absently, while reading as though communicating with the babe, the slight breathlessness that came upon her after climbing stairs, the glow that seemed to emanate from her skin as though lit from within, and he developed protective instincts he could not seem to control, rising automatically when she entered a room, offering his arm for even short walks through the house, watching her with a vigilance that bordered on obsessive concern for her well-being and that of their child. It was on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn when Eleanor had been coming down the main staircase with a book tucked under one arm, her attention focused on the hem of her gown to avoid tripping, and that her foot caught on the edge of a step, and she stumbled forward with a small cry of alarm, and Callum, who had been crossing the entrance hall below, moved without conscious thought, reaching her in 3 long strides and catching her against his chest as she fell, his arms wrapping around her waist and drawing her against him with such force that her book clattered to the marble floor, forgotten. For a long moment they stood frozen in that embrace, Eleanor's hands clutched against his shoulders and her face pressed to his chest, where his heart hammered with the terror of what might have happened, and he became acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched, the softness of her against his strength, the floral scent of her hair beneath his chin, the rapid rise and fall of her breathing that matched his own, and when she lifted her face to thank him, their eyes met and held with an intensity that stole the breath from his lungs. He knew he should release her, should step back and restore proper distance, but his arms seemed to have developed a will of their own and tightened instead, drawing her impossibly closer, while his gaze dropped to her lips, and he saw them part slightly, as though in invitation, and the electricity that had been building between them for weeks suddenly crackled to life like lightning before a storm, and Eleanor's internal voice whispered desperately that she could not do this again, could not allow herself to hope or want or need this man who had broken her so thoroughly once already, even as her treacherous heart beat faster and her body softened against his, and some reckless part of her wondered what would happen if she simply rose on her toes and closed the small distance between their mouths and tasted the lips, had dreamed of kissing properly for 5 long years. The moment shattered when a footman cleared his throat discreetly from the doorway, and Callum released Eleanor so abruptly she swayed before steadying herself against the banister, both of them flushed and breathing heavily as the servant announced with apologetic urgency that an express message had arrived from Willowmere Estate, requiring immediate attention, and Eleanor's face went pale as she reached for the sealed letter with trembling fingers, while Callum watched her scan the contents and saw fear replace the heat that had been in her eyes mere moments before. The fire had started in the eastern wing near the kitchens. She read aloud in a voice that shook despite her visible effort at control, and though the staff had managed to contain it before it spread to the main house, there was significant damage, and several of the long-time servants had been treated for smoke inhalation, and before Callum could form a response, Eleanor was already moving toward the stairs, with determined purpose, saying she must go to them immediately, must see to their care and assess the damage and ensure everyone was truly safe, for these were the people who had become her family during the lonely years when she had no one else, and the thought of them hurt or frightened while she remained in London's comfort was unbearable to her conscience. Callum found himself saying he would accompany her before his mind had fully processed the decision, his voice brooking no argument as he instructed the footman to have his travelling coach prepared within the hour and to send word to his secretary to cancel all appointments for the following week. And when Eleanor turned to him with surprise and wariness mingling in her expression, he met her gaze steadily and said with quiet intensity that Willowmere was her home and their child's inheritance, and he would not allow her to face this crisis alone, though the deeper truth he did not speak was that the thought of her leaving even for a few days had become suddenly intolerable, as though something essential would be ripped away if she passed beyond his sight. The journey to Willowmere took 6 hours in the well-sprung coach, and as the miles rolled past beneath the wheels, Callum found himself truly talking with Eleanor for the first time, not the careful pleasantries of their recent meals together, but genuine conversation that delved beneath surfaces into the territories of hope and fear and memory. And she told him of her childhood in her father's crumbling estate, where she had learned to make beauty from scarcity, and had dreamed of someday having a home she could tend and nurture into flourishing life, while he confessed his own boyhood terrors after his younger sister had died of scarlet fever and his father had forbidden any display of grief, teaching him that to love was to invite devastating loss, and that a duke must remain above such vulnerable human emotions. As the coach turned up the familiar drive to Willowmere with evening settling over the countryside in shades of amber and violet, they arrived to find the household staff gathered anxiously in the forecourt, and Callum watched Eleanor transform before his eyes as she climbed from the coach and immediately moved among them with gentle questions and reassuring touches, learning each person's condition and offering comfort with such natural grace that he finally understood completely what he had been too blind and too damaged to see before, that this woman possessed a strength born not from hardness, but from an inexhaustible capacity for care, and that in trying to diminish her he had only revealed the poverty of his own spirit. The following morning dawned cold and grey over Willowmere, and Callum found himself rolling up his shirt sleeves alongside the groundskeeper and stable hands to assess the fire damage and begin repairs, his fine London clothing exchanged for borrowed work garments that smelled of wood smoke and honest labour, and as he moved through the eastern wing, examining charred timbers and water-damaged plasterwork, he began to truly see the estate Eleanor had built through her own determination and vision. The kitchen gardens she had expanded now provided vegetables for the entire household and surplus for the village. The dairy had been modernized with equipment purchased from her careful management of the household accounts he had never bothered to review. The tenant cottages had been repaired and improved until families who had been preparing to leave for factory work in the cities had chosen to stay. And everywhere he looked, he saw evidence of her intelligence and care, transforming what had been a neglected property into a thriving home, and the realization of how completely he had underestimated her settled over him like a weight he deserved to carry. The staff treated Eleanor with a warmth that bordered on reverence, but their reception of Callum ranged from cool politeness to barely concealed hostility, and he could not fault them for it when he knew what stories they must have heard about the Duke who had abandoned their beloved mistress to loneliness and neglect. And it was late in the afternoon when Mrs. Thornbury, the elderly housekeeper who had served at Willowmere for 40 years, found him alone in the damaged pantry and fixed him with eyes that had seen too much to be intimidated by titles or rank. She spoke to him with the blunt honesty of someone who had earned the right through decades of service, telling him that she had watched Eleanor arrive 5 years ago as a frightened young bride full of hope, and had witnessed that hope die a little more with each of his cold visits. This had held Eleanor while she wept after he left, following that terrible dinner she had prepared with such care only to have him treat it as an obligation to be endured, had seen her transform her pain into purpose by pouring all the love she had to give into this estate and its people, since her husband would not accept it. And Mrs. Thornbury said with quiet steel in her voice that Eleanor deserved a man who recognized her worth, and if the Duke could not be that man, then he should have the decency to let her go, rather than continue to break her spirit with his indifference. The words struck Callum like physical blows, and he found himself unable to offer any defense because there was none, and he thanked Mrs. Thornbury for her honesty with a humility he had never shown before, and spent the remainder of the day in silent reflection on the magnitude of his failures, until evening fell, and he found Eleanor in her private sitting room in the undamaged western wing, a simple space filled with books and pressed flowers and watercolor paintings she had created during the lonely years, and he asked with a vulnerability that felt like tearing open his chest whether she would allow him to speak truly for once in their marriage. And when she nodded with cautious eyes, he began to apologize, not with excuses or justifications, but with raw acknowledgement of every way he had wronged her, explaining the cowardice and fear that had driven his cruelty, but making clear that understanding his motives did not excuse the damage he had caused. And as the words poured from him like poison finally being drawn from a wound, he felt something shift in the foundations of who he had allowed himself to become. Eleanor sat very still in the worn armchair she had claimed as her own during the lonely years, her hands folded over the swell of their child, as she listened to Callum's confession with an expression that revealed nothing of the storm within her heart. And when he finally fell silent with his carefully constructed defenses lying shattered at his feet, she drew a slow breath and spoke with the measured deliberation of someone who had learned through hard necessity to weigh each word before releasing it into the world. She told him that she understood pain and fear, that she could comprehend intellectually how the loss of his sister and his father's cruel lessons had taught him to equate love with suffering and vulnerability with weakness. But understanding the origins of his behavior did not erase the years she had spent waiting for a kind word that never came, or the nights she had cried herself to sleep, wondering what fundamental flaw in her character had made her unworthy of even basic consideration, and her voice remained steady, though tears had begun to slip down her cheeks as she said that his pain, however real and however tragic, had not given him the right to inflict equivalent pain upon someone who had done nothing to deserve it, except agree to marry him when her family's desperation left her no other choice. Callum flinched as though struck but did not interrupt, and Eleanor continued with a raw honesty that felt like excavating her own grave, confessing that the deepest cut had not been his absence or his coldness, but the realization that he had not even cared enough to hate her, that she had been simply nothing to him, less than nothing, a burden to be hidden away and forgotten, except when duty briefly required his attention, and she had loved him desperately at first, with all the foolish hope of a young bride who believed that patience and devotion might eventually soften his heart, only to watch that love slowly starve and wither until she had been forced to kill it deliberately, like putting down a suffering animal, because letting it linger was destroying her spirit and her sanity. She paused then, wiping her eyes with trembling fingers, and Callum spoke into the silence with a voice rough with self-loathing to say that watching her strength these past weeks, seeing the estate she had built, and the people whose lives she had improved, and the grace with which she had faced society's judgment, had forced him to confront the cowardice he had dressed up as self-protection, that he had told himself he was guarding his heart, when in truth he had been nurturing his wounds and using them as excuse to remain safely numb. But seeing her thrive without him had shattered the comfortable lie that his isolation was necessary or noble, because it revealed that what he had really feared was not loss, but the terrifying vulnerability of being truly known and potentially found wanting. The candles burned low in their holders as they sat in that simple room, speaking truths that should have been shared years before. And when Eleanor finally whispered that she had loved him once, but had been forced to let that love die in order to survive, Callum felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut since childhood, and he asked with desperate need to know whether love once dead could ever be resurrected, or if he had destroyed beyond all repair the one thing he was finally ready to cherish. Eleanor sat in the flickering candlelight and looked at this man who had caused her such profound pain, seeing for the first time not the cold duke who had hidden her away, but a damaged soul who had mistaken self-protection for strength. And she answered his desperate question with the careful honesty that had become her armor and her salvation, saying that she did not know whether love once dead could be resurrected, because she had never before attempted such an impossible feat. But perhaps what they needed was not to resurrect what had died, but to begin entirely anew, to meet each other as strangers without the weight of their painful history, except as lessons learned and scars acknowledged. And she proposed with trembling voice that if he truly wished to know her, and to be known in return, they might start again from the beginning, as two people learning whether something real could grow between them. Callum seized upon this offering like a drowning man grasping driftwood, and in the days and weeks that followed as winter deepened over Willowmere, they embarked upon the courtship they had never been granted before their hasty arranged marriage, walking together through the frost-laden gardens she had nurtured, where she showed him the roses she had coaxed back to life and the herb beds she had planted, following instructions from Mrs. Thornbury's grandmother's journals, and he listened with genuine fascination to her explanations of soil composition and growing seasons, and discovered that her intelligence ranged far beyond the ornamental accomplishments expected of ladies into practical knowledge that had saved this estate from ruin. They spent long evenings in her sitting room, reading aloud to each other from volumes of poetry and philosophy, and Callum found himself astonished at the depth of Eleanor's thinking and the wit she revealed when she felt safe enough to lower her careful guard. Her observations about the texts they shared, often more insightful than those of his university friends who had been so proud of their classical educations, and these conversations stretched late into the night until the candles burned to stubs, and they both struggled to keep their eyes open. Yet neither wished to end the precious communion of minds and hearts. He began to court her with small gestures that spoke of attention and care, bringing her the first snowdrops that bloomed in the south garden because she had mentioned loving their delicate resilience, ensuring the fire in her chambers was always properly tended, asking her preferences about everything from meal planning to evening entertainments, rather than simply dictating his will as he had done throughout their marriage. And Eleanor watched this transformation with cautious hope, warring against self-protective skepticism, afraid to trust that this vulnerable, considerate man was truly who Callum could become, rather than a temporary performance that would dissolve once he had secured her forgiveness. Yet as the weeks passed and his attention never wavered, as she witnessed him helping repair the fire damage with his own hands and speaking respectfully to servants he would once have ignored, and asking her opinion on estate matters with genuine interest in her answers, she felt something unfurling in her chest like a spring bud pushing through winter soil. Not the desperate love of her naive younger self, but something stronger and more complex, a regard built on witnessed character rather than hopeful fantasy, and she realized with wonder and trepidation that she was discovering not who she had imagined Callum to be, but who he actually was when he allowed himself to be fully human and imperfect and real. They returned to Ashworth Manor in early March, when the first crocuses were pushing through the snow-patched earth, and though the grand estate remained unchanged in its physical magnificence, everything felt transformed because Callum and Eleanor entered it not as reluctant strangers bound by legal contract, but as genuine partners who had earned each other's trust through patient honesty and vulnerable revelation. And the household staff who had served the Duke for years noticed immediately the softness in his expression when he looked at his wife, and the protective tenderness with which he guided her up the stairs, and the way he consulted her about every decision, from which chambers they would occupy to how the nursery should be prepared. Eleanor bloomed in these final weeks of her pregnancy, not merely from the physical changes of impending motherhood, but from the radical transformation of being truly cherished, and she would sometimes catch Callum watching her with an expression of such wonder and remorse intermingled that she would take his hand and remind him gently that they could not change the past, but only shape their future, and he would press his forehead to hers and vow again that he would spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of the grace she had extended. When her labor began on a rain-washed April morning with the scent of wet earth and new blooms drifting through the open windows, Callum refused to leave her side, despite the midwife's scandalized protests that gentlemen did not attend such intimate proceedings, and Eleanor gripped his hand through each wave of pain and drew strength from his presence, even as she cursed him thoroughly for his role in creating this agony, which made him laugh through his tears of worry and pride at her spirit, even in extremity. Their daughter entered the world just as dawn broke over the eastern hills, her first cry piercing and strong, and when the midwife placed the tiny bundled form in Callum's arms, he stood trembling with his face streaming tears as he looked down at this perfect miracle they had created. This innocent soul who represented everything he had almost destroyed through his cowardice and cruelty, and he spoke to his daughter in a broken whisper, promising that he would be the father she deserved and the husband her mother should have had from the beginning, that he would teach her never to settle for less than authentic love, and would show her through his actions that people could change and grow and become better than their worst selves. Eleanor watched this scene from her bed with exhaustion and joy overwhelming her in equal measure, seeing this man who had been so frozen and distant, now overflowing with raw emotion and unconditional love. And when Callum finally brought their daughter to her and sat carefully on the bed's edge, they looked at each other over their child's downy head with such profound intimacy and hard-won tenderness that words seemed unnecessary, though Callum leaned forward anyway and kissed Eleanor for the first time as her true husband rather than her legal captor, a kiss that tasted of salt from their mingled tears and promised everything they had both thought forever lost. And in that moment, their genuine marriage finally began. 3 years had passed since that rain-washed April morning, when their daughter Catherine had entered the world and changed everything, and now Willowmere Estate in high summer blazed with the full glory of Eleanor's beloved gardens, where roses climbed ancient stone walls and lavender bordered the winding paths, and the herb beds flourished under her careful tending. And it was here in this place that had once been her exile but had become her sanctuary, that the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth had chosen to make their primary home, visiting London only when business demanded, and returning always with relief to the peace and beauty of the countryside. Eleanor sat on a blanket spread beneath the old oak tree, watching Callum chase their daughter Catherine through the flower beds, the child's delighted shrieks piercing the warm afternoon air as her father caught her up and swung her high, while pretending to be some fearsome dragon she must escape. And Eleanor's hand rested on the blanket beside her, where their infant son Thomas slept in his basket, with his tiny fist curled against his cheek, in an expression of perfect contentment, and she marveled at how completely her life had transformed from those dark years when she had lived as a ghost in her own marriage to this abundant present where love flowed as freely as sunlight. Callum set Catherine down, and the girl immediately demanded he chase her again, but he begged a moment's respite and came to collapse on the blanket beside Eleanor, his dark hair disheveled and his formal coat discarded hours ago, so that he looked nothing like the cold Duke who had once greeted London society with such careful reserve. And when he looked at Eleanor, his eyes held such warmth and devotion that she sometimes still caught her breath at the miracle of it, at how this man had journeyed from cruel distance to this intimate tenderness. He reached for her hand and pressed it to his lips, as he had done countless times in these 3 years, each gesture a renewal of his vow to cherish what he had nearly destroyed. And Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, while Catherine attempted to fashion daisy chains nearby, and baby Thomas stirred in his sleep, and they sat together in comfortable silence that spoke of deep understanding and hard-won peace, and Callum murmured against her hair that he could scarcely remember the man he had been before, that bitter, frozen creature who had thought protection from pain was worth the cost of joy. And Eleanor reminded him gently that they must remember, because the scars of their past had shaped them both into who they were now, stronger and wiser, and capable of appreciating the precious gift of genuine love. because they knew intimately the agony of its absence. The afternoon sun slanted golden through the oak leaves, casting dappled patterns across their family tableau, and Catherine brought her completed daisy chain to crown her mother as queen of the garden, and Callum lifted his son from the basket to hold against his chest, and Eleanor looked at her husband and children and the beautiful estate she had built through lonely years, and thought that suffering, when it leads to transformation and healing, becomes not a tragedy to forget, but a foundation upon which to build something extraordinary. And she was grateful for every moment of her journey, because it had brought her here to this perfect afternoon, where love was no longer a distant dream, but the very air they breathed. Dear listener, perhaps you have journeyed with Eleanor and Callum through their story of pain, transformed into healing, and recognized in their struggles something of your own heart's landscape. For the truth we must acknowledge is that the greatest love stories are not those that begin with effortless joy, but rather those that are forged through the fire of genuine suffering and emerge tempered into something stronger and more precious than what came before. And Eleanor's courage to stand in that ballroom despite her fear, and Callum's difficult journey from self-protective cruelty to vulnerable authenticity, teaches us that transformation is always possible, though never easy. That it requires from both parties the willingness to be honest about pain inflicted and received, the humility to acknowledge wrongdoing without defensiveness, the strength to demand better treatment while extending grace for genuine change, and the patience to allow healing to unfold in its own necessary time, rather than rushing toward reconciliation before its foundation has been properly laid. We must remember that Eleanor did not simply forgive Callum's years of neglect and emotional abandonment because he suddenly showed interest, but rather she held him accountable, demanded he prove through sustained action rather than temporary words that his transformation was real, and protected her own heart carefully while remaining open to the possibility that people can indeed change when they choose to face their fears and do the difficult work of becoming better versions of themselves. This balance between self-protection and openness to growth is perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of human relationships, knowing when to extend another chance and when to walk away, understanding that while some people are worth the patience and pain of waiting for their transformation, we must also value ourselves enough to refuse to remain in situations where we are diminished or denied the basic respect and love we deserve as human beings worthy of genuine connection. Eleanor's story reminds us that sometimes the strongest thing we can do is demand to be seen, to refuse to live in shadows, even when revelation means risking everything, and that speaking our truth with courage can catalyze change in ways that silent suffering never will. If you find yourself in a relationship where you are hidden or diminished or treated as less than you are, may you find Eleanor's courage to stand in your truth, and if you recognize in yourself some of Callum's patterns of self-protective distance and emotional cruelty born from past pain, may you find his willingness to face your fears and choose vulnerability over safety and to risk your heart rather than protect it at the cost of authentic connection. May you know that healing is possible, that happy endings can be earned through honest effort and mutual respect, that the scars of our past can become the foundation for something beautiful if we allow them to teach us wisdom and compassion rather than bitterness and fear. May you find love that sees you fully, challenges you gently, and chooses you consistently, and may you offer the same in return. May your nights be filled with peace and your heart with hope, and may you remember that your story is still being written and transformation is always possible. If this tale has touched your heart, consider subscribing to our channel and sharing these stories with others who might need the reminder that even the deepest pain can lead to profound joy. When we choose courage over comfort and growth over stagnation, and until we meet again in the next story, may you rest well.